Jennifer, super stoked to have you on the Mark Divine Show. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to talk to you and jumping through hoops trying to get our tech to work. It was fun to learn about your new living arrangements. Tell us about that. I'm really excited about that. My wife and I have been toying with the idea of buying a house, and Jeff and I have talked about it too, about buying a house over in Italy, and fixing it up and something like that. But you've taken it to a whole nother level in
Yeah, it was
France.
during COVID. It was during COVID, and we all, I was sitting around with friends, as you do, um,
As you had to do during COVID, stuck
as you
inside.
had to do, stuck inside. And I had a friend come and stay with us for like a month because you couldn't move around very much. So she
Right,
came, she stayed, and we were talking about, what would our dream living situation be?
right.
And, there was a bottle of red wine involved and some cheese probably. And so we got around to thinking that our dream living situation would be to buy like a big place in the countryside in France and live there together with our favorite people.
Oh, cool.
And and so we were like, that sounds like a fun dream. That'll probably power us through the rest of COVID, right? Just to
Right.
have this dream would be great. But we got a couple of people involved who don't just believe in having dreams, they believe in realizing
Mm-hmm.
them. And
My kind of people.
so there we go. And so before we knew it, we had a little band of folks who were interested. I'm the chief executive of my company, and I knew it would be create kind of weird dynamics if I invited some people and not others. So I
Hmm.
invited everybody, anybody who wanted to come live with us could come live with us. And we got 10, now 12 people who said yes. And here we are a year
So,
later.
where did the actual finding of this 21 bedroom, family resort enter into that whole equation?
Well, it is
Did you find a
so fun.
broker? Did it just stumble on it with an internet search? Super
Yes, we
cool.
just spent so much time on the internet looking at French castles, and this is so much fun. This is
That
so
is
much fun
fun.
to
Yeah.
text each other, images of castles and to imagine living in this one or that one. The one that we ended up in is not a castle, but it was a resort. Um, and uh, and it's just been kind of dreamy
Are
to
there a
live
lot of
here.
these places like on the market? Like, could I go buy a French castle tomorrow if I had the money? I
You
guess
could buy
so.
a French castle tomorrow, and you would need very little money.
Really? Hmm. You got my head spinning. Yeah, I'll need a caretaker. I could probably share a caretaker with you. That's awesome. So you're living kind of, is it like a formal relationship where you have like an operating agreement and rules and expectations and you're shopping on Wednesdays and I do the gardening on Tuesdays kind of thing or what? How's this working?
Yeah, so we believe in complexity and about
I've
leading
heard,
our way through complexity, right?
right?
So we are founded on complexity principles. And so we figure things out, we notice what patterns are emerging, and then we amplify the ones we like and we try to kill off the ones we don't like.
Hmm.
And so that means we didn't make agreements beforehand.
Hmm.
We moved in, we saw how we were living. We said, oh, these things are working really well. Let's do
Hmm.
more of that. Let's see
Hmm.
how we can ritualize that. Oh, these things we don't like that much. Let's see how we can figure out how to let go of some of those.
Hmm.
And bit by bit, we found our way.
And do you think this is going to be a long-term thing or is it just a fun, well, we did that for a couple of years, check the box and everyone go back to your own ways.
No, we talk about growing old here. We talk
Ah.
about growing old here. My son, I have a 21-year-old son. He was talking about, in my generation, in his generation, what's going to happen with this place, and
Hmm.
how is that generation going to deal with sharing and
Yeah, that's a whole nother
living
level of
here.
complexity, right? Holy
This
cow.
is a whole nother level of complexity.
This
Yes.
is so cool. I'm so stoked to have met you and just learned about that because it really just opens up my mind about, possibilities and it's a really interesting world and things are changing so fast and that's why it's so interesting to be talking about complexity today. Man, it just seems like it's so much more complex. And that might be an appearance, right? But it just seems like because of the explosion of technology and changing demographics and geopolitics and the world between you and me and listeners, it's going to look really different in 20 or 30 years than it does right now. People have no idea what's coming, right? No idea. And
that's exactly right. And we can't begin to predict, right? And any
right.
predictions would be ludicrous. It would be laughable for us.
The only prediction that would work would be that things will be really different, and you'll probably be pretty accurate.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So before obviously, you know, the focus of our conversation today is complexity and your new book, Unleash Your Complexity Genius. But I want to learn a little bit more about Dr. Jennifer. Like, how did you get interested in this? What were some of your early formative experiences that shaped you as a person and then as a professional, you know, to get, you know, your academic work and et cetera?
So I've always loved stories. I love humans. I love their stories. I was an English teacher for a while.
Okay.
And then I went back to school to get my doctorate in adult development, which is our story, right? How is it that we unfold over time?
That's in the field of psychology, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And for me, the question that became really interesting is, how do we grow better able to meet the demands of our world, which is complexity, basically.
And adult development really is growing through stages of complexity, transcending, including. And I'm very familiar with the work of adult development psychologists like Susan Crook-Reuter and Claire Lovinger or Jane Lovinger and Claire DeGraves and Ken Wilber. And those have had a big influence on my life. And I think it's the interesting thing is around this idea of complexity that I want to hear how you applied it to your life is, how do you find simplicity inside the complexity? Because you just described one way you do it with your living arrangement, but I think that's a really cool place to start.
Yeah, I think that this is the question about complexity is, how do we work with it and not against it? Right. Which is basically your question there.
Right. Yeah.
Because if you're trying to figure out, how do I build something that keeps the waves from making me wet? Right. Like, you have to deal with storms and weather, and you have to think about every possible thing if you live at the seaside. But if you think to yourself, how do I work with the waves and do something cool with what's here? It's a totally different task, and in many ways much simpler. And so this has been my fundamental question, is, how do we recognize complexity and then work with it, harness it in some ways to create the lives we want to lead?
Did you ever work as a psychologist, or did you, parlay your PhD into this leadership development work right away?
I worked as a professor. So I started as a professor and then began to work more and more in the leadership field.
Got it.
And then have found myself being incredibly curious about how it is leaders who are now faced with jobs that are basically inconceivably complex, right? You can't even get your head around them. How do they get big enough to not only handle those jobs, but to do what I think organizations need to do, which is work together to change the world?
Yeah. Yeah. I think I love how you frame this, because, I've always thought, one of my heroes, of course, Steve Jobs, like he's just one of those really, really interesting cats, and who, really believed that simplicity was the key to genius, or it took genius to find simplicity and an unlocked genius. And so he was all against complexity, right? And he thought that was the, like the death knell of a business, is like we're dealing with that actually in our own business. Too many products, too many services, too many different types of customers. And yet finding your way through that, navigating that, and finding the essence of what it is, both the why and the how and the what of what you're all about. That's genius, right? Then that gets to the simplicity, right? So I'm curious, like, how did you make this leap from adult development to genius and complexity? I'm like, where did the puzzle pieces fit together for you that led to your current, vein of work that you're exploring?
Yeah. So I'd like to make a a distinction that I'd have loved to talk to Steve Jobs about,
Sure.
which is the distinction between things that are complicated. They have a
Yeah.
ton of moving parts, there are too
Hmm.
many sectors, there are just a lot of pieces, and things that are complex,
Right.
which are interdependent, have their own kind of energy, their own kind of emergent properties.
Right.
I think that we often confuse those two things.
Right.
Businesses are often too complicated,
Yeah.
right? And we often are trying to think everything through and make a Gantt chart for this or that or the other thing. Like, this is very common. But Steve Jobs was great at understanding the complexity, the interactivity
Right.
of the world,
So do
right?
you think they're qualitatively different things, or is complexity just more complicated than complicated?
I think they're qualitatively different things. The
Okay.
complexity theorist Dave Snowden would say that complicated things are solvable, right? You put the pieces in
There's
order in a
cause and effect
particular way,
relationships, right? Yeah.
cause and effect relationships, and you can solve them. In complexity, you can't know. So they emerge. And
Yeah.
so instead of being able to plan and control and contain, which is what most leaders, most of us have been taught we ought to do, in complexity, we have to explore,
Right.
connect, learn, experiment.
Yeah. Well, I think that during the, industrial age, all the way up really until the internet, and maybe beyond, even into the first, decade of this century, we we had the appearance that things had a linear cause and effect relationship. It's not actually true, I don't believe, but it had the appearance because it seemed like things moved a little bit slower, so you had time to, like, get feedback loops and plan and, do the kind of the OODA loop thing. And then things just started to speed up. So it seemed like, oh, wow, we've entered a different era. I think the reality is complexity and complicated coexisted all along, right? But people just focused on, we had the time to do the planning and the iteration. Now they don't. So it takes a
Well, and
new type of thinking
we had the tools and the capacities to tame
to tame. Yeah, I
a
like that
bunch
thought.
of a bunch of the things in our world to kind of keep them inside a particular box, and we could make
Right,
that happen, and now we can't.
right. Well, and you could even make the argument that it was a mirage that we can make that happen because,
Oh,
like,
for
look
sure.
at the field of economics. Like, I have an undergrad degree in economics, and of course I believe it was utterly useless, right? Because none of that actually works, and
Yeah, that's right.
it seemed to work, but then it created these conditions for complete disaster, right? So then
That's right.
they apply these new tools that seem to work for a little while, but creates another condition for exact
That's
disaster
right.
because they're not understanding the complexity and the interrelatedness of all these, hundreds of trillions of components to an economy that makes up an economy.
That's right. That's right.
So it's too bad we don't have a different word for complexity, because people mistake it for complicated, but let's just go that we don't have that. So where do we start in trying to understand complexity? Like, if someone's new to this, like a listener going, oh, this is really interesting, Jennifer, how do I start to cultivate the capacity to deal with the complexity in my business?
So I think the first thing we need to do is recognize what our body does when we're faced with complexity, right?
Interesting.
What our body
Yeah.
does is our body recognizes complexity and uncertainty and unpredictability as threat,
It's a risk. Yeah, it's a
right?
risk.
'Cause
Fight or flight. Boom.
it's scary. That's
Right.
exactly right. It's exactly right. So it activates our nervous system, and just as it activates our nervous system, it has us want to command and control, to narrow our focus, to put our hands on things and force them to happen, um, to protect ourselves. All of these things are understandable, but not helpful in
Right.
complexity. And
Yeah.
so, if we can understand the signals our body's giving us, then we can start to say, oh, wait, thank you,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe I should do something else.
Mm-hmm. And I think, like, the body of an organization has that same reaction.
For sure.
Right? So you can have
For sure.
organizations went into fight or flight, and certainly during the pandemic. And if you weren't able to get out of that quickly, then you didn't survive.
Because you needed to innovate,
You
right?
needed to innovate. Right.
Protecting actually is not innovative at all, right?
Right.
Protecting is very uninnovative. And in a really fast changing world, protection is not going to get you where you need to be.
Yeah. Okay, so that makes sense to me, and that's kind of in alignment with what I teach special operators. Like first, pause and breathe, right, and that resets
Right.
your nervous system, and also create a daily practice. We use box breathing to essentially train your body to be in a de-aroused, you know, rest and digest state, calm, from which you can make better decisions. So let's assume we've done that, or we train someone to do that, and you're working with a CEO. Now what's next? Like, still, there's just this insane, you know, cacophony of information and interrelatedness, and it's the VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world is right there in front of me. But I'm calm. So now what do I do?
This is a huge advance, huge advance.
It's a big step forward, but I'm still not sure what's next.
It's huge. I mean, one of the things I think people need to recognize in that state is they can't go it alone,
Oh, I
right? You
like
just
that. Right.
described the 10 million things
It's
that are going
impossible
on.
for one individual to figure things out. Yeah.
You can't go it alone. You need to understand, how do we as a collective function, and how do we as a collective function better and better over time? So it means that it's not just your nervous system you have to calm, it's the nervous systems of those around you too, right? You got to
Right.
take care of your own body, but you've also got to be managing what's going on for others, because you need them and they need you. And so then the next step, I think, is to create the conditions for those people to build incredibly strong bonds together, to trust one another, and then to be able to activate those things that make us awesome at complexity, which I call the geniuses, right? That help us handle complexity beautifully, as humans have also handled complexity beautifully for thousands of years.
Right. I can see where you're going. This is pretty cool. So you get the body of the organization calm and collected, and then you work on teaming. We call it the three foundations for a great team are courage, trust, and respect, which require a lot of emotional awareness and emotional development. And what Brene Brown would call vulnerability, and really recognizing that oftentimes it's our own projections and judgments and perfectionism and righteousness that is what gets the energy of a team stuck. So clearing all that, so the team has this team mind, right? Collective mind that's free of the ego. So from then, now you've got 10, 20, 30, 50, hundreds of minds that can fuse together to create, a genius level mind that can create, come up with solutions that are far, far better than any individual.
So we also need to, I love that you're emphasizing this way we're connected, which is incredibly important. And we also have to be diverse, right? We have to be different from each other, and we have to allow for our differences, and we have to actually amplify and use our different perspectives in order to see into corners that other people might not see into, right? If you take an incredibly diverse set of people, you get them to function as a really highly effective team, but they think that they can't use their diversity on that team, then you've just lost a lot. So here we get them to make good use of their diversity. And I think the other thing I believe we have to do is we have to laugh. We have to have fun together. We have to figure out how to lighten our spirits, because it's in that place of play that creativity really lives.
Right.
And so
creativity is a positive process.
Right. That's right.
It comes from positive love frequencies. It doesn't come from fear and contraction. Yeah.
That's exactly right. Right. And teaming is that way as well, right?
Yeah,
teaming comes from this desire to be bigger together than any of us are by ourselves.
Oh, I love that. The idea of being bigger together is cool. Okay, so we're calm, we're connected, we're inclusive, we're diverse, we're amplifying our differences, de-energizing things that get us stuck, and we're doing that with a lot of play and laughter. And then now what? What's next?
This
This is so cool.
this
I'm
is
like
great,
literally,
right?
it's all falling into place in my mind. I'm like, oh, this is really cool. I love this roadmap you're drawing here. Yeah,
This is
but
right.
that's a lot of
So
work, though. What you just described, like that's very, very uncommon, by the way. Right? Most
indeed,
people are thinking, I would love to
indeed,
have a team like that. Wow.
indeed, which is why I think that a, a leader's job is really uh, to amplify the conditions that make this more possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because as you said earlier, humans get into groups, they have their perfectionism, they have their contractions, they have their egos, they have their stories, they have
Mm-hmm.
all these things that get in the way of what we are absolutely wired to do, which is connect with one another, play,
Mm-hmm.
create. Um, so so a leader needs to figure out a lot of leaders think my job is to solve problems and to enable other people to solve problems. It's not
Mm-hmm.
wrong,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it's small. This
Mm-hmm.
is small.
Yeah.
My job is to create the condition where problems are solved,
Mm-hmm. I like
right?
that.
So what is
Yeah.
that? How do I create the conditions so the solution to problems just starts to pop like popcorn?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, I need to figure out what that takes. And this is what my focus should be on creating that surround so that solutions happen.
Mm-hmm. So, what are some of the best ways to create the conditions for where problems are spontaneously solved?
So I think that there's a lot for us to be thinking about as we think about welcoming humanity into
Mm-hmm.
our workplaces,
Mm-hmm.
right? Workplaces have basically, for the last 100 years or more, segmented, chopped, removed, kind of tried
Mm-hmm.
to take as much as possible the human out of the
So true.
workplace
Factory
and put some
settings,
kind of
human resources.
exactly.
Right.
That's exactly right,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like to emphasize the machine-like capabilities and to try to define your job really narrowly so that it doesn't touch the job of the person right
Yeah.
next door, so that we can, as much as possible, control the hell out of everything we're doing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Well, so creating the conditions is about releasing
Mm-hmm.
that idea and to say, okay, so what are the conditions for human thriving, and
Mm-hmm.
how could I make that in my workplace? So how do we start with connection? Not connection as an afterthought, not connection as an icebreaker, but connection as the fundamental ground on which we exist.
Mm-hmm.
How do we then add purpose, right? the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the fundamental human need to do work that's meaningful, purposeful, because then now you have connection, you have purpose, you add in this idea of diversity and being able to really see across differences and use our differences, and suddenly you have popcorn, right?
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly you have a place where solutions happen.
I love that. You talk about operating at the intersection of inner and outer complexity. So, what is that? How do we find that intersection? And what are some tools that you work with your clients to unlock that capability or capacity?
Some so I think the thing right at the intersection is our body,
Yeah.
right? It's right here because there's the complexity of the world out there, then there's our psychology,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's the body that mediates those things,
Yes, I love
right?
that.
And
Mm-hmm.
so I think box breathing, for example,
Mm-hmm.
is a tool. I also use this,
Mm-hmm.
right? To be able to be at that mediation space so that we will be able to handle the complexity of the world. Then you need tools to make sense of that, because humans
Mm-hmm.
don't automatically make sense of complexity. We're not good at that. Our brains don't work that way. So we need tools like polarity management, or tools that help us listen in new ways to each other, or tools that help us get a handle on what kind of problems this is and therefore what should be done with it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so there are a ton of tools that help us in the world out there.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are these tools that help us in the world in here with our development, as you were saying earlier, with our capacity to regulate our own nervous system, and also with our capacity to regulate the stories we tell
Hmm.
ourselves that are feeding our ego and that
Hmm.
create defenses.
Yes, totally get the inner development we work a lot with. So that makes a lot of sense. And then I think what is unique about your work and where we're starting to head is that they become a team process, right? So the idea of the deliberately developmental organizations, like you go to work and it's not like all your development is on home on the yoga mat or the meditation bench, or the park bench breathing and taking in sunshine and listening to the birds. But you come in and together as a team, you do box breathing, and as a team, you practice mindfulness, and as a team, you work on your listening and communication skills, and that's like amplifying what you said. What's working at the individual, you bring it in and you amplify that, and then it just really opens up kind of the team inner dynamics in a healthy way.
And it helps us understand that for me to be doing my job tomorrow, I need to be growing today,
That's right.
right?
Yeah.
And for us together to be successful in our enterprise
Mm-hmm.
next year, we have to grow into next year.
Mm-hmm.
And
Love
we
that.
know that this is true of children. We know this is true, that for a child to be successful, that child needs to be growing every year. It needs to be
Mm-hmm.
learning, reaching beyond what they could do last year. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's just as true for us as grown-ups.
That's right.
But we have this idea that we've arrived someplace, or we
Right.
have this idea that our business card defines or describes us in some way.
Mm-hmm.
When groups begin to take collective responsibility for the development of the group, amazing things happen. Amazing things happen.
Mm-hmm. You're right. I mean, statistics on adult development aren't pretty, or they haven't been pretty in the past. Like most adults pretty much just stop, and then they slide into what Carol Dweck would call that fixed mindset. And I think I remember reading somewhere that like only 5% of the world is got a growth mindset or something like that. That just sounds extraordinary, like a low percentage. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, because I know it's becoming more and more prevalent to kind of unlock growth, and to adult development has started to really grow exponentially in the last few years. So it's probably not 5% anymore. But,
I know, much to my surprise and delight, I have to say. The this question about how do we create the conditions to help people grow on purpose
right.
has been the question that I've been carrying for basically my whole career.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we specifically do that at work, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we help each other create the conditions which require failure, stumbling, humanity, grumpiness,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like annoyance,
Mm-hmm.
bad feedback, all these parts of being a human that we don't like as much. And so we try to wash them off or not show them at
Mm-hmm.
work.
Mm-hmm.
It's required for us to grow. And we
Mm-hmm.
need to believe that the whole thing is allowed.
That's right. Yeah, and that the emotional development there is just to get over this idea that there is some sort of perfect way to be, right? Because perfectionism for leaders, especially male leaders, who think, okay, oh, and like you said, if you get the title, boom, you think, well, I must have been perfect in order to be CEO, so I've got to protect that image, and that's disastrous,
It's
right? Because there is no
disastrous.
such thing as perfect, and failure is not such a, we said in the SEAL teams, their failure is not an option. It wasn't because we couldn't fail. It's because the idea of failure was anathema to us, because we knew that we were going to fail practically at everything we tried. And so we embraced it for the learning that it would bring to us. That's what that saying meant. And that's where,
That's right. This idea of failure means there's one objective and we either make it or we don't,
right.
which is not what life.
No.
The one thing we're sure of is we're going to die, right? Like this is the one thing that's super clear to all of us. This is not the thing we're barreling towards and trying to succeed at, is that everything else is uncertain, everything else. And
Mm-hmm.
so how do we live our lives in a way that takes advantage of that uncertainty instead of
Mm-hmm.
pretending it doesn't exist or wishing it away or feeling stressed out by it?
Mm-hmm. I love that. I want to get into just two specific things. You mentioned managing polarities as like a tool for helping with the external complexity environment. I'd like to talk about that, and then I would like to talk about the most successful, or the tool that you've had the most success with, perhaps, in helping to navigate the internal complexity. And then we'll kind of wrap up from there. As I think, I'd love to get some like practical tools, and recognizing that
Sure.
most people listening to this are either driving or, walking. They're not like taking notes. So
For
we'll have to
sure.
navigate the complexity of it and keep it simple.
For sure.
Awesome.
So one of the tools my clients like the best is a tool developed by a man called Barry Johnson,
Hmm.
on this managing polarities question.
Hmm.
And basically, Barry has created this unbelievable simple tool for us to deal with things that feel irreconcilable, the
Hmm.
contradictions in our life that feel like so opposing,
Hmm.
and we really struggle with them. Like, do we, if you have a big organization, do you standardize or do you customize,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
um, your question right now that you might be facing in your organization is, do you diversify or do you simplify,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
Like these are tensions that live in opposition to each other.
Hmm.
And the answer, when we're in one of these questions, do we do this thing or do we do its opposite, then the answer is almost always yes, you do both of those things,
Both. Yeah.
right?
It's interesting.
um, and so then the question is, how do you navigate that? And Barry's created a tool that lets you map, these are the benefits, and these are the things that happen when you overemphasize one of these things at the expense of the other. And then from there, you can begin to take groups um, through kind of understanding the map of the complexity of the world they live in, and then making specific choices.
Hmm.
So basically, all of my favorite complexity tools are mapping tools of one kind or another,
Hmm.
because maps help us simplify,
Right.
help us handle, put our arms around the complexity so it's not like just wandering around in this
Hmm.
aimless way, but they focus the mind, they focus the attention on particular aspects of complexity so
Hmm.
that we can then move forward. And polarity management is one of the best of all of these tools, I think.
That's so cool. I want to investigate that further. And I agree with you. Maps, you have to know the terrain. So you have to be able to put the elements, in this case, complexity or the polarities, onto the map so you can understand the terrain, and then you can map your way through it and navigate it more effectively. It's similar in therapy of just objectifying the underlying issues so you can work with them. But you can't objectify
Exactly right.
them and name them. How do you work with them? Yeah.
That's exactly right. You got to put them out on the table so you can walk around it, look at it from different
Right.
aspects, and then make choices.
Right. Okay. So what about inner complexity? What's a tool that is really effective there?
So I got to say, it's a map,
The
right?
map.
You
Okay.
you
Yeah.
talked you talked about Suzanne Cook-Reuter's work.
Yes.
I love Suzanne. The I studied with Bob Keegan,
Hmm. Yeah.
so the map I use most often is Bob Keegan's
Hmm.
map.
Hmm.
But this idea that there's a map with recognizable places and that we can make sense of our lives, we can say, oh, that's what was going on to me right there.
Hmm.
Oh, that was a time when I was so made up by other people
Hmm.
that I couldn't decide for myself. That makes sense to me now.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I could grow from that place into a place where I could make those choices on my own. There are
Hmm.
just some gentle definitions in this map, and I have seen this map change the lives, oh, cheapers, of thousands and thousands of people, tens of thousands of people that I've
Wow.
worked with.
I believe it.
Just knowing, oh, there is something I could grow into.
Yeah.
It's different from now.
Hmm.
And some of the pain that I'm feeling is actually not the pain or the discomfort that kind of is just like a blister in my shoe, but it's actually the pain of birth, right? Like
Yeah.
it's the pain of gestation, it's the pain of bringing into the world the next iteration of me.
Yeah.
And that next iteration is going to be bigger, more complex, more capable than who I've been up until now.
I love that. I totally know what you're talking about. I've done, the Cook-Reuter leadership maturity assessment, and the ability to see, well, here I am at
Yeah.
self-actualization, and yet my leading edge is in heading into unitive or, whatever for whoever is taking, but also the awareness that working on the leading edge isn't going to get you there. Often it's working on the trailing edge and overcoming
That's
the
right.
blockages and the shadows that are like a rubber band holding you back. Like you can't spring
That's right.
forward until you get rid of those things that are blocking the energy. What's the assessment that Robert Keegan uses or that you use for this? I'm curious.
I use a thing called the growth edge interview.
Growth edge.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
That's
So
cool.
it's an interview to figure out what these blind spots are, right?
Right.
What are these things I can't see
Mm-hmm.
about how I make sense of the world?
That's fascinating. So how do you work with individual leaders or companies or groups, teams? And how do you actually do the work?
Do all those things. I
All those
coach
things.
individual leaders. We work with teams, leadership teams. We
Nice.
work with whole organizations and
Mm-hmm.
design leadership programs to help organizations have more of a mindset that helps
Mm-hmm.
them grow the whole
Mm-hmm.
enterprise.
That's
We do
awesome.
all that stuff.
Yeah, it's fantastic work. I'm really stoked to have learned more about it today. Your company is called Cultivating Leadership. Is that the website, like cultivatingleadership.com, or what's the website?
That's
Yeah.
it.
Okay,
That's
perfect.
exactly it.
And your book, Unleash Your Complexity Genius: Growing Your Inner Capacity to Lead, is out recently published, right?
Just this month it came
This
out.
month.
Yes.
Congratulations. I know how much work
Thank
it
you
is to put
so
out a
much.
book. I'm working on my 6th one right now. It's a lot of work. So good job. It's going to be awesome. And where else can people, or where would you prefer people to hook up with you? Website, social
Yeah.
media?
Come to the website. I'm on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, all these. I live in all these places. Can come
Yeah.
and visit me in France.
I was going to say, and if someone
It's
wants to come stay in one of your 21 bedrooms,
it's a big
where do I
world.
find that
It's a big
option on the
world.
website?
We find each other.
That's awesome. Jennifer, thank you so much for your time today. It's been very enlightening and it's going to help a lot of people find their genius in this complex time that we live in. So it's important work.
Lovely spending time with you, Mark. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. Hoo-yah.